Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dreamleapers with Harriette Cole. Now, I know because I've been doing this show for a long time that many people who tune in are secretly wanting to be writers. They're wanting to be engaged with the media in lots of different ways. And me being an author first, a writer first, I love talking to people who live in that space. And so our guest today has spent her career in one way or another in the space of media, writing, and even more helping people who want to make that dream come true, to write a book, to make it happen. So if you are an author, a storyteller, or you're interested in publishing, you are in for a treat today. Our guest is Miral Sattar. She's an author, publishing strategist, podcaster, and digital entrepreneur with a passion for helping writing professionals succeed. Isn't that great? She is the founder of multiple platforms that offer guidance on the self-publishing realm, and her expertise has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine, PBS, and plenty more. She is also the creative mind behind an amazing children's podcast called Barely Bear. This podcast reimagines classic fairy tales that we all know and love, offering them through new and diverse characters and teaching invaluable lessons of friendship, courage, self-confidence, and so much more. So we're going to dive into all this right now. Please join me in welcoming Miral Sattar. Hi there.
Hi, Harriette. Thanks so much for having me. It's a real honor and a real treat to be here today.
Well, and I just loved as we were digging into your story to see who you are and all that you've done. I started my career in magazine publishing. I started at Essence Magazine and have worked with a lot of different publications over time. I was at Ebony for a while, and when I was there, it was exactly at the time that many publications were figuring out how to have an online presence with their physical magazine. And it was such a clunky experience. And they couldn't figure out how it would make money. And I remember just across the magazine publishing landscape that it was so difficult to understand how to step into this new space that was then called new media. You have worked long enough in this field to have been in that space in the early days. Can you just talk about how media has changed over, not that many years, like 10, 20 years, say?
So it's really interesting. So I started out as a developer and I had a passion for storytelling. So I used to build applications for corporate clients, but I loved storytelling. So I had a friend who said, why don't you apply to a bunch of media jobs because that's where your passion is. So I did, and I ended up at Time Magazine. And this was, and I'm sure you remember this was circa 2006, 2007, where everyone was getting into, we need to have a website or we need to have a podcast. And most people forget, but there were no iPhones before 2010, 2011. We all had Blackberries when we were
flip phones, StarTAC, there were all those kinds of things, right?
I actually just found one of my old ones and I showed it to my kids and they're like, what is this? Is this like a mini computer? so I said, this is how we used to use phones in the olden days, and they're like, oh, okay. They were kind of confused, but it was a wild time because no one had figured out the monetization strategy. So it was an incredible time to launch podcasts, websites. I had an opportunity to launch the iPhone apps, and then also I launched a lot of the digital strategy. So I did SEO for quite some time. I taught the producers and the writers how to make sure their content gets discovered in search. So if you're writing a meaningful story, this is how you get it found in search. And most people didn't actually buy in until they actually saw people going to their content or getting featured or getting hundreds of millions of website hits because they use the proper keyword. So combining tech.
I'm curious, Miral, how did you learn how to do that? Because that specific talent and skill to understand, here's somebody writing a story, but being able to position that story so that it can reach the broader audience and making it palpable for the broader audience. That's what every content creator needs to do, but it is not necessarily a skill that a writer per se knows how to do. How did you learn that?
So I'm a tech background. So I came from tech, and I became a content creator once I mastered the tech. So I knew how to build the platforms. I knew how to take an SEO training. And I trained everyone at Time Magazine and Time Inc. and people on how to get their content found in SEO. And subsequently, I trained authors how to find their books found on Amazon. And now I train authors and podcasters on how to get their content found on social media. It's through search engine optimization. So once you know what people are looking for, and once you crack the code and the algorithm and you teach it to everyone, then they see that if they tune their keywords. So I'll just give you an example. So we had magazine. So there's magazine writing, and then there's tech writing. So if someone writes once in a lifetime events, you don't know what that is, because that is what our writers at Time, when I was there, would describe a lunar eclipse. So when you teach them that you need to put in the keywords like lunar eclipse and then the subheadlining, and it shows up in the top search in Google search, and it increases your views, then people are sold. And same with Instagram, same with Amazon. When you fine tune the keywords on Amazon, you have to match exactly what people are looking for, and you want to have your content ready so they want to buy your book or read it immediately or listen to your podcast. So you have to create that compelling story to do it. And it's cross-functional. It's in the headline, it's in the keywords, and it's in the way that the videos are put together.
And it's interesting because there's a school of thought, well, you want to be really creative, get really creative. And then also what you're saying, however, is be literal.
Yes.
Be really literal so people can find what they're looking for. They're not looking for the creative language necessarily. They're looking to understand this that I'm looking for is right here.
Yeah, I mean, I just did a workshop at one of our local libraries where I taught a bunch of writers, and a lot of writers and a lot of people on social media, they go online and they say, hey guys, it's Miral, or like, hey guys, or hey everyone, it's Sophia. And I always tell them, don't do that, because you've already lost 3 or 4 seconds of time and people have already started scrolling. So you want to engage them at the hook, and you want to make them watch the whole video. So that is just one of that's one of the first tips that I give every author, everyone on social media. And once they eliminate that.
They eliminate, hey, introducing themselves.
Yeah.
So what you do instead?
You can have it in a text. So you want to hook. So so the whole thing about social media and getting your content discovered is the art of good storytelling. I mean, you're an incredible storyteller, but if you're not telling people immediately and you're on a phone and you're scrolling and you see 20 videos and everyone's starting off with, hey guys, you don't know what the point is. So you're going to keep scrolling. So you need to have visual hooks. You need to have a beautiful cover image, and a visual hook can be something. I'll give you an example of a fairy tale that is one of my fairy tale stories that's going viral right now, and it's actually creating a lot of controversy on Instagram. The hook that I used is something called "There's Only One Country Rapunzel Should Really Be From," and I said India. So because that is one of the few countries where Indian hair is revered. Our strategies are copied. They're mimicked in the beauty industry, but Indian women have been doing it for hundreds of years, thousands of years to get this beautiful hair. So the hook that I put in, and then the question that I put in is, no hair would be able to withstand the strength of a prince climbing up it unless it's Indian hair or Persian hair.
Oh.
And so I just checked the stats right before we got on this got on this stream, and it's at 2 million right now, and I have 70,000 comments. But there's a lot of hate comments, but a majority of the people are actually looking at the story and saying, oh, this sounds like an interesting podcast. So I actually just also hit record-breaking downloads this week too.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's really amazing. So many things. For just sticking with that for a moment, because I want to get to your podcast, but the thinking of things that will give people pause, that tactic, there's only one place where Rapunzel should be coming from. That is, it makes you think, well, what place is it? So you tap in to see what in the world is she talking about. When you get the hate comments along with the others, because when those come, it can be really tough. Right. How do you withstand that? What do you do when you get a lot of people who are venomously opposed to whatever it is you're saying?
So I check to make sure, the first thing I do is the overall messaging still positive, or is it creating a harmful idea in the space? So right now, about 75% of the people love the fairy tales based on the question that I put. And there are several thousand comments. Most of them are like, I love this. I wish this was around when my daughter was there. But you will get you get several thousand that are like, oh, Indians are disgusting, or you're smelling. The comments get pretty awful, but that is the nature of the internet. So 4 years ago, when I first went viral, it really, really bothered me. But 99% of the people who look at your content when something goes viral are not the people who normally follow you. So these platforms are kind of showing your content to new audiences. And if it keeps performing well, they will keep showing it to new audiences. So these are people you've never interacted before. When I was checking the analytics earlier this morning, the number one city that people are listening to fairy tales, and I was quite surprised, is Dallas, Texas. And then number 3 was Houston, Texas. And normally it's New York or Chicago or Washington, D.C. or somewhere in California. But the Texas update was pretty interesting. So the overall,
when you look at the analytics and learn that, then in doing further analysis, which this just happened this morning, so you probably haven't done that yet, but why does this particular fairy tale resonate so much with Texans?
I think probably because of all the rollbacks that the government is doing. I published a story a few weeks ago, and the story was about a dictator who is based on a political figure who's in power right now in the United States. And the story is called 3 Goats Gruff. And it's about 3 goats who are trying to cross a bridge, but they're prevented the crossing because there is this horrible troll. And the troll has these misconceptions about them, and he thinks they're going to come to his land and destroy the place. But in the end, it's a beautiful story, and they end up crossing, and they actually contribute more than he thought they would have taken away. So it's also the trending keywords. People are looking for stories right now that I think negate all the negative stuff that's going on right now.
And that is a classic story, Billy Goat's Gruff, but I see the twist on it. Let me remind folks, this is Dreamleapers with Harriette Cole. We are having a fascinating conversation with author, storyteller, publisher, podcaster, Miral Sattar. And this is a fascinating conversation in part, Miral, to me, because of you've been in this game long enough to have a lot of perspective. And I think that's helpful because people are trying to figure out where can they get credible content. There's content everywhere, but where can they get credible content, and then often how to find it. And so you're explaining how to find it with the SEO optimization. Is that what it's called?
Yes, SEO.
Mm-hmm. I think it's really important, but also let's get into the storytelling. And I want to address the thing that is worrying so many people, which is this notion of wiping out diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Mhm.
This is something that was promised, but I think a lot of people thought it wouldn't happen, that it was rhetoric. And we learned on day one of the new administration that it was in the inaugural address. And many companies, I've talked to a bunch of companies, people representing very large companies and smaller companies, have been grappling with, how can I follow the law? Because some of these things are being presented as law. And how can I maintain all of these strides that we have made where we're welcoming everyone? We're making an effort. There's a big concerted effort to see people for who they are, to recognize them for who they are, and to value them. And so as a woman of color doing this work, and now with your podcast series, really looking at reimagining these stories, what are you hoping your contribution can and will be to maintaining an understanding of diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Well, first of all, I just want to say that I really appreciate you saying diversity, equity, and inclusion, and not just calling it DEI, because a lot of people say, "Oh, I hate DEI." Like I live in New York City, and we have so many parents here who make comments, not knowing what my background is, about how DEI is ruining our schools, how DEI is ruining education. And when I tell them that I review inclusive books, they're like, "Oh, that's ruining everything for our children. They're making them feel bad about themselves." And I say, no, it's actually not. It's because it's important to be able to tell stories, because telling stories about who you aren't, or telling stories about yourselves, your culture, about different worlds, you see representation. And when children see characters who look like them, come from a similar background, it builds self-esteem. But then also for children who aren't from those backgrounds, it creates cultural understanding and empathy and kindness. So it only betters the community. There's no negative aspects about it at all. And I went to a talk by an author in New York, Ta-Nehisi Coates, and his main thing was, we need to tell our own stories, because that's how the world is going to perceive us, is how we put ourselves out. So that's kind of the thread of everything, right? Is we need to be able to writing our stories. And just to touch on that point a little bit, is when I started researching the origins of the fairy tales, everyone assumes that they came from the Grimm brothers, or they came from Charles Dickens, or they came from cultures that didn't have much representation. But in my research, I discovered the story of Beauty and the Beast is actually based on a real historical figure. His name is Petrus Gonsalves, and he was an enslaved person from Spain who got sent to France. And he was treated as a pet because his body was so hairy. And that's how Beauty and the Beast came about. And then you have stories like Rapunzel. And the original people get really upset when I changed her hair from brown.
She has braids. I love it. Yes.
And they said that you're ruining the fairy tales. The original character is German. And actually, the original character is not German. The original character goes back to ancient Persia. And it was in a museum where they have a display of the story of Rapunzel. And she has long, flowy hair. And she has braids. And the prince is coming to rescue her. So our stories have been culturally appropriated. So we're just kind of going back to the origins of the original stories.
That's fascinating. You know, I've recently interviewed James Monroe Iglehart. He played Genie in Aladdin on Broadway.
Oh, wow.
So and anybody who saw those ads across every bus and everywhere, it was he in that image. And he described to me that the actual role of a genie back in olden times,
Mhm.
not fiction, but back in history, this person was often an enslaved person, a person of color, often African, who was forced to take on this role of entertaining the people who were the rulers of whatever country it was, but they were people of color. And apparently what also they did, Miral, which I thought was fascinating, because they were using humor, they would often take jabs at whoever the leadership was, the king, the whatever, the court, in clever ways, so that they weren't even necessarily realizing that they were taking jabs at them, but it was clever. And so James was explaining what we know and what you just described. When we look at our history, when you go back far enough, what do you learn? And very often what you learn is something completely different from what is the party line, so to speak.
Totally.
Yeah.
I have a lot of Disney enthusiasts who come after me in the comments on
I
social
bet.
media. And they say the original Cinderella, this is not the original Cinderella. And I'm like, well, actually, the original Cinderella, her name was Rhodopis, and she was Egyptian, and she was not the Elizabeth Taylor version of Egyptian, but she was an Egyptian slave who fell in love with a Greek prince. And the story dates back to 64 AD. So the history is there, and it speaks for itself.
I love that you know the history. So this is so perfect, Miral. So I interviewed Akili Tomasin, I think that's how you say his name. He is the curator of the show at the Metropolitan Museum of Art right now about Egypt.
Oh, nice.
Through a Black lens. And if you haven't seen it, you should go see it. It's up until February 17th. But what he talked about with me is what you're describing. That it's always go back, do your research. You have to dig deeply because it's not always easy to find, but the richness of global heritage, culture by culture, is worth learning, and very often includes people of all backgrounds. It's not in this Eurocentric patriarchal society when people are trying to say it's just white males. Untrue. Right. It's the globe. It's everyone. We all have contributed to culture, which is why it's so great that you're doing this work. I really appreciate that you're doing it. How long have you had this podcast?
I launched it in 2022. So this is year 3 now. Yeah. So
and why is it called Barely Bare?
Oh, I get that question a lot. It's called Barely Bare because when I did the first iteration, the idea, and I was beta testing it, the idea was that you could listen to the stories through a bear, a stuffed animal. And when I was beta testing with my two kids who were younger, I gave I gave beta tests to all their bears and let them listen to the stories. And the feedback that I got from parents was, it's a little confusing to have the bear. Can I just listen to it as a podcast? Or do you have it on YouTube? Can they listen to it on YouTube, or can they watch it on YouTube? So I decided that we're going to ditch the bear, and the stories were called Barely Ever After. So I thought it was still a cute name, but I also love the name too. So that's kind of why it's called Barely Bare. So I still have the old prototypes of the Barely Bare, and the plan is to launch them at some point. I'm just not sure when that will be.
So you started this podcast when we were still at home during the pandemic, right?
Yeah, that's when I started beta testing it and sending it out to people.
Okay. And so I'm curious too, especially because of your knowledge about reaching audience. Back then, when people were at home, it was a perfect time to beta test things because folks were home. They were hungry for connection, hungry for any kind of positive energy that could come their way. And subsequently, when people are back out and about, as we know, the streaming services and network television and all of these entities have been struggling a bit because they don't have the same eyeballs that they once had. You just finished telling us about millions of people connecting with your podcast. How are you building your audience so that it is so large, especially given a lot of organizations are having difficulty holding on to audience?
Well, I think people want the content and they want the stories. And when I get requests from parents all the time, when is the new season coming out? Or can you do a new story based on Pocahontas? Can you do a new story based on Moana? Kids love the podcast. And kids, I think, are the biggest. They love content and they love fresh content. And every time I produce an episode or I executively produce an episode, I don't narrate all the episodes. We have to split them up a little. The thing that's always in the back of my mind is we're competing against these. We're competing against shows. So how do we make the content engaging that you would want to make a kid want to listen to a podcast more than they would want to watch TV? And also during COVID, we went through a period where everyone was on screens all the time and parents want breaks from screens. So that's kind of how we pitch it. So my middle son, he gets sick in the car quite a bit. And part of it, I think, is because we live in the city. He doesn't go in the car that much. I used to be car sick too. And there's some studies that say listening to songs and listening to podcasts actually helps relieve motion sickness. So that's one of the things that we tell people is when you listen to podcasts or when you listen to stories, it's a good way to stay entertained in the car without using screen time. We're also distributed on this little device called a Yodel player, which is kind of like the kids' version of, I want to say, cassette tape players or Discman. Is that what they were called? Oh, walkie-talkie. What were they called?
Walkman.
Yeah, Walkmans. Yeah. So my son has one, and by the way, he's not interested in my fairy tales at all. He's only interested in the 5 stories that he listens to on repeat every day. He takes, it comes with little cards, and he's able to take a card, put it into the player, and it'll play a song, or it gives him agency, and he can actually listen to the story or listen to the song, and he walks around the apartment and he loves it, and it keeps him entertained in the car too. So we're distributed on a few platforms like that. And I think once the platforms like Apple and Spotify know that families are listening to your content, they feature you. So a couple months ago, my sister-in-law's cousin texted me saying, "Hey, I just saw your name pop up as a recommendation on my Spotify list." And I was like, "That's amazing. Can you send me a screenshot of it?" So yeah. So once the content is discoverable, so first it has to be good, and then you have to make it discoverable, and then you want people to keep coming back for more. And that's part of creating good storytelling.
And as I listen, and especially like the Rapunzel one, as I was listening and I'm listening to the fact that she has braids, and it is plural. I hear that she has braids. I want to see her. Is there any chance that you will animate this program?
So that's something that we're working on right now, and I'm actually really excited about it. So yes, it's in the works. So we've actually been talking about that quite a bit.
I think that's great. Hey guys, this is Dreamleapers with Harriette Cole. And right now we have a wonderful guest. She is Miral Sattar, and she does a lot of things in the media space. Just now we were talking about her children's podcast series called Barely Bear that reimagines classic fairy tales from a diverse perspective. And because the word diverse and diversity has somehow become a bad word, Miral, just before we move on from this topic, please define what diverse means to you in this storytelling.
Diverse means hearing or listening or telling a story about someone that normally you would not have heard or known about if you hadn't listened to the story. So it could be, so one of my really popular story was based on Snow White, but she was called Amira of Abeba in Sudan. And what we talked about in the fairy tale is because skin was darker, it preserved its beauty, because women who have darker skin tone look younger and are more youthful. So it was kind of, it weaved its way into the story. And parents want to hear positive storytelling about themselves. Like they don't, you don't want it to be like, oh, but I'm beautiful. You just want to hear, oh, this is beautiful, or because of this.
And so as a storyteller who's using a diverse lens, in these times where we are right now, there's a lot of fear. There's a lot of fear to even say these words.
Right.
There are companies who have taken those words, diversity, equity, and inclusion, out of their, off of their websites, off of any online placement, off of their literature, because of this fear of being contracted. What can you suggest to people, especially people with children, who, this is in the news every day. It's not something that's hidden. This notion that being a person of color, being a woman, being different in any kind of way makes you less than and unworthy. All we work to do is to teach our children that we love them and that they're worthy of all the great things in the world. What is the creative antidote for that? Not just this particular work that you're doing, but you work with a lot of other creatives. What might that look like?
Well, I always say create the stories, write the stories, and the people who are searching for them will come, because everyone is searching for them. And it's interesting you brought that up about people rolling back their DEI initiatives. So last week was Lunar New Year. It was Wednesday, and normally, and I was really surprised when I saw this, there was no spot on it on the Apple Podcast. And historically, they have a collection of stories for Lunar New Year. I work with a collaboration of kids podcasters, and we help each other out. When we have a collection, we're putting together a collection right now for Black History Month. Even though I don't always highlight stories just during the months, I feel like these stories should be told all year round. But the collection, putting the collections together actually is kind of an SEO strategy, because people are searching for that content during the time, but the stories are all throughout the year. So it was interesting that they didn't put any Lunar New Year stuff on Apple Podcast collection, and usually they have a pretty big collection. And I noticed that for Black History Month, they had one little button where historically half the page would be featuring Black History Month.
Well, it's interesting. There was a list of all of the celebrations that represent diversity, from Black History Month, Women's History Month, Lunar New Year, Holocaust survival. I mean, there were about 20 different things on a list that were identified as we're not going to celebrate those this year. And it was shocking. Apparently, Black History Month, that got reversed. And so now Black History Month is going to be celebrated. I think probably this reversing that almost feels like you're getting whiplash, because here's this outrageous thing, and if people complain enough, then it goes backwards. But I really wonder about our kids in school. Kids can be cruel anyway, and kids in school, some feeling emboldened to say, you aren't worthy. You're part of that thing that we don't have to act like we like you anymore. I'm worried about that.
And it's a valid concern. So that's why we need to keep creating the stories and telling the stories, because the reason someone behaves cruel or they have a negative response to something is because they've never been exposed to it before, or they've never been exposed to that type of person before. And that's actually harming to their understanding of the worldview and how they see the world and how the world is around them. And it's interesting because I remember I was looking at these numbers and I thought, okay, so what percent of people are actually from one demographic? And 84% of the world, when you look at it from a non-US lens and more of a global lens, it changes the conversation a little bit, right? So 84% of the world's population is African, Asian, Latin American, or indigenous in some way. And that is a conservative estimate. So that means only 16% of the world which is a minority in terms of the world population. So it changes the dynamics quite a bit. And one fact that my sister-in-law told me is, she's like, aren't most males descended from Genghis Khan anyways? And I looked it up, and 1 out of 200 people in the world are actually descendants of Genghis Khan. Yes, which is a wild stat. So you can try all you want, but the data suggests otherwise, and the people suggest otherwise. So people, as long as we keep telling our stories, you can't stop us.
Well, what I like about Barely Bear is, as you listen and listen closely to stories, there's so much that is affirming. And it's not beating you over the head with it. It's subtle, but it's there. And it is this notion of inclusive. There's not just one background of person. There are a number of different ones depending upon each of the stories, which I appreciate that as I listened to a number of them. I want to turn the page now to the work that you do helping others, because I've read that you help a lot of people get published. We know that this notion of getting a publisher, a traditional publisher, is incredibly difficult. And also it can be a challenge when people self-publish, of how do they get the word out so that they didn't just write a book and it sits somewhere and nobody knows that it's there. Can you tell us how you work with authors, what that process is like? And is this something that you still do?
Yeah, so I used to run a platform where I used to connect authors with publishing professionals, but that got acquired. And now I actually help authors build their platforms so they can self-publish or get a traditional publishing deal. And I'm sure you noticed in the last few weeks, social media is kind of its own beast. So I tell everyone, start a Substack, build your following on Substack, or start a mailing list, because that is your direct connection. It shouldn't just be about social media. So, but you have to have one narrative. And when you have that narrative, talk about it all the time and then let everyone know about it. So build your mailing list, create the videos, be a good storyteller, which is what I teach people how to do. And the readers and the listeners will come.
And what would you say are the basics of storytelling? This is definitely my wheelhouse, so I'm very curious. I love people who do this. And by the way, and I know you know this, a lot of people are not innately good storytellers. It takes work. It takes a lot of focus and harvesting of information. So in your definition, what are the elements of good storytelling?
So the elements of good storytelling, no one has actually asked me this question before. So this is an excellent question. It's a story that needs to be told, that's inside of you, and that just needs to be shared with the world. So everyone who I know has written a book, whether it's a cookbook of family recipes where they're passionate about sharing with the world, or it's a story that they've had inside of them, they have this desire that the story needs to be told to the world. So that's one. Second, then, are the components of having a good story is the character. You want the character to be relatable, and you want your audience and your readers and your listeners rooting for the character. and then you want them to succeed, and you want the people reading or listening to champion and have them succeed. And I think those are the kind of basics of good storytelling. And you need to set up the story like in the first 5 seconds, which is getting harder through social media or through the first paragraph, because in the digital world, the click-throughs and the watch times are really important. So that's how a lot of these algorithms work, like on YouTube, on Instagram, even on Amazon, is people judge a book by its cover. So you need to be able to sell the story in that scroll or in the first 5 seconds of the video.
And that is so different, Miral, than, when people leisurely would pick up a book.
Yeah.
What is that? Although some of us still read books.
Yes.
But a lot of people can consume content on these devices. And it's tricky, to hook people, but then keep them so that they want to experience a story, that they aren't feeling like they just have to rush through it. How do you manage that dance of, I got them, I got to get them right now, and then how to keep them?
How to keep them? Keep writing the next story. And if I don't have time to write them, run the repeats and change them up a little, or run other stories. So I'm part of a collective called Kids Listen, and they are children's podcasters. And if we run out of stories, then we run other stories with similar values and similar messaging through our feeds to kind of highlight them too. Or there's something called story swaps. So it's lifting up because bigger creators did it for me. They helped lift up my stories. So now I do it for the newer people, because the content's there. There's no end to the content.
Well, and you just said something that I think is important for people who may be out there alone. Mm-hmm. Find or create a network.
Yes.
Because you have a network of people who are doing something similar. How did you all create that network?
So I think I found them through social media. And I started engaging with them on social media, and they invited me to join the group. And I went to one conference, and there was maybe 20 kids podcasters there, and they were the most inclusive people I've ever met. So I've been to tech conferences, I've been to publishing conferences, but the people who work with children are like the writers and the podcasters do it because they want to share stories, not because they're profit driven. And it's good to be profit driven, but the core values and the inclusivity of children's podcasters and children's book writers really goes through, shows and shines.
That's great. Hey guys, this is Dreamleapers with Harriette Cole. We are having a wonderful conversation, and this creator who's done so much, Miral Sattar, is really giving us wisdom based upon her experience and how she's helped so many others, which I really appreciate that, because people want to know how. How can I do what my heart is telling me to do? My program is called Dreamleapers. The purpose of it is to inspire people to access and activate their dreams. And when I talk to people who are doing it, and also even better, who are helping others, it's so good. Miral, when you talk about having millions of people view or listen to a podcast, does that monetize your podcast?
So the increase in traffic is recent. So we have had people reach out to run ads on it, but also like media, what we were talking about earlier is I think the advertising model is pretty broken, and there are innovative ways to think outside of the box and to include everybody. So that's kind of what I'm working on now.
So that goes back. It's been many years now where it's a tricky thing of how to monetize creative content in these different ways. And being able to reach a big audience is obviously important, and it helps to make lots of other opportunities possible because you can prove that you have a substantial audience. For folks who are looking to monetize these opportunities, monetize their creative vision on new media, on social, what are some recommendations that you could make?
So I say think of it as a whole package and not just one channel. So some people will start just a podcast, but then they won't start a social channel and they won't have a mailing list. So make sure you have all three and pick the platforms that you like, but make sure you're everywhere, because email is a valuable thing. You want to, if you're writing a book and you send an email about it, I would say like 20% will actually probably buy the book and review the book, right? That's based on the stats that I've seen. And make sure you connect with your audience and be social. And my whole expertise right now is in social media. So I would say start that account, experiment, figure out how the algorithm works. And I have a free account that teaches you how to do that. So once you figure it out, then you build your audience, because I feel like that's how your idea grows and gets more eyeballs. And it is probably the most cost-effective way to do it. And also test an idea is if 4 million people view that video and they're consistently viewing those videos, then yeah, you have an idea that people want.
You pay attention to those numbers. So how can people access the this, what you just mentioned, that could help them learn how to do it? How can they access that?
Oh yeah, so it's called Miral Teaches, and that is my handle on Instagram and TikTok. But if you go to Miral Reads on Instagram and TikTok, I have all the links available in my profile there.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, and congratulations on creating Barely Bear and for all of the work that you're doing, especially helping other people to make their dreams manifest. I have one more question before you go. You have children. I think you have 3 children. What do you teach them about accessing their creativity?
So I have 3 very different children. My oldest one is into books, and she is an incredible cartoonist. She's 11 and a half. And she asked me about how books work and how they're published. So we actually created a kids invention journal. So she designed the cover, she designed the pages, we put it on Amazon, and my kids are not on social media, but I marketed it on my social media and it became popular, and I gave copies to her class. So she loved that. And it's funny because somebody actually just reached out and put in an order of 500 invention journals that she had done. So I told her that the money for this can go to anywhere she wants. So, because we started it as kind of an idea to help refugee families who were here a few years ago. So I told her she could research and decide where she wants to put the money for the journal. So
Wonderful.
Yeah. And then my middle one, he's into math and chess. So those are his loves and like love lives. I cannot really connect with him on the chess, but we try to play. And then my little one, he's a builder. So it's just encouraging him and showing them that there are other experiences too.
Well, that's wonderful. Well, thank you for joining us today, and check out Barely Bear. It's really fascinating how you've repurposed, reimagined these stories. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Harriette, for having me. It's been an honor.
And thank you to all of you for tuning in to Dreamleapers. We just finished having quite a conversation with Miral Sattar. She is the creator of Barely Bear. Check it out. It's wherever podcasts are available. And until next time, have a great day and make it count.